the political and economic prelude. The tone is intensified. The pillars of democracy crumbled. In their place rose the cult of the leader and a poisonous nationalism that demanded total sacrifice.
Behind closed doors, the new Axis is signed in blood.
Tokyo's militarists reached a fatal conclusion. An empire without its own resources is a slave, and resources must be seized by force. By 1939, the world was a powder keg waiting for a match. The era...
Global trade is dead. Harbors. He who controls the semiconductors controls the future.
Factories that once built cars now build tanks. Every spare ton of steel is being forged into a weapon for the coming storm. December 13, 1937. Nanking was more than a fallen capital. It was a strategic vacuum that invited chaos.
Stop running! Reorganize your ranks! Where is the commander?
In military strategy, the greatest weapon is discipline. But in December 1937, in the city of Nanking,
when the Japanese Imperial Army breached the walls, the chain of command didn't just bend, it completely shattered. After the brutal Battle of Shanghai, the Japanese Imperial Army moved toward the Chinese capital. What should have been a decisive occupation turned into a 6-week logistical and moral nightmare for the Pacific Theater. Soldiers. Nanking was a fortress, but its defenders were broken. Strategically, the city was a trap. Strategically, the loss of control was total. Without oversight, a disciplined military force mutated into a lawless, predatory mob. When the walls fell on December 13, the Japanese High Command issued a silent permission. The city was theirs. 300,000 lives were not extinguished for tactical gain, but by a fever of unchecked depravity that stained an empire's honor.
As a strategist, I see a command vacuum. General Matsui was ill. Prince Asaka was ruthless.
The contest to kill 100 people using a sword wasn't just a rumor. It was a gamification of genocide. From a tactical perspective, this was a failure of leadership. Commander Iwan Matsui allowed his troops to discard every rule of engagement.
logistically, the Japanese army didn't bring enough supplies. Their strategy? Live off the land.
Soldiers went house to house, not searching for insurgents, but dragging out civilians for public, cold-blooded executions.
Systematic sexual violence was weaponized against 80,000 women. This wasn't war, it was a breakdown of the human soul.
Strategic error. By committing these atrocities, Japan destroyed any hope of a peaceful Chinese surrender. They created an enemy that would never forget. Amidst the horror, a German businessman named John Rabe established a safety zone, protecting 200,000 desperate civilians.
Man, using his Nazi party status to shield victims from his allies. A bizarre, strategic irony in the heart of darkness.
The Yangtze River became a mass grave. Thousands of bodies tied together and bayoneted.
By the time the fog cleared, Nanking was a city of ghosts. The strategic objective was lost to a sea of blood.
The casualty log, 300,000 dead. In more than 2 days.
But justice was a fragmented prize. Many perpetrators simply vanished into history.
From a tactical perspective, Nanking was a hollow victory. It gained territory, but lost the war for the hearts and minds of Asia. The rape of Nanking remains a strategic stain. It is the proof that an army without ethics is just a mob with high-powered rifles. Even today, Nanking remains a volatile fracture in international relations. A wound that diplomatic ink can never fully close. Strategists study Nanking to learn about uncontrolled aggression. When you let your soldiers become monsters, you lose control of the mission.
The strategic error.
The world watched in horror. The reports from Nanking began the slow turn of international opinion against the Japanese Empire. Decoding the defeat. Nanking proved that power without accountability is the quickest path to strategic and moral bankruptcy. Fatal miscalculation. Japan thought terror would bring China to its knees. Instead, Nanking became the heartbeat of Chinese resistance.
But if Nanking was a failure of discipline, Our next chapter explores a masterpiece of cold, 300,000 lives. One city, 6 weeks of madness. Coming up, Unit 731, where humans were no longer soldiers or civilians, but merely logs for biological testing.
If Nanking was the fire of rage, our next stop is the zero of cold calculation.
What happens when an empire trades its humanity for a vial of plague? The answer is more terrifying than any battlefield.
The rape of a city is the death of an army's soul.
Strategically, Japan knew they couldn't outproduce the West. Their solution? To win through biological and chemical supremacy.
Deep in Manchuria, Lieutenant General Shiro Ishii established a heavily guarded complex.
The human subjects were called Maruta, logs. In the eyes of a strategist with no conscience, they were just raw logistical material. "1,000 victims. Chinese, Koreans, Soviets. No one was a person here. They were biological variables in a twisted equation of war."
What happens when a military command replaces bullets with bacteria?
They studied the progression of the plague, cholera, and anthrax, not to cure them, but to maximize their lethality on the battlefield.
Imagine a surgery with no anesthesia. Living dissections to observe the effects of disease on internal organs in real time.
Deep in Manchuria, the Japanese created a water purification unit, but the strategy wasn't survival. It was a biological apocalypse. Strategically, Ishii was obsessed with limits. How much pressure can a human eye take? How long can a limb stay frozen before it shatters? Led by General Shiro Ishii, this was science as strategy. To them, human beings were not people. They were Maruta, logs of wood. They conducted frostbite experiments in the brutal Manchurian winter, freezing prisoners just to test different methods of thawing. Logistically, it was a factory. A 6-square-kilometer death camp designed to mass-produce the plague, anthrax, and cholera. As a strategist, I see the darkest form of force multiplication. Why bomb a city when you can infect a single well and kill thousands? They even tested flamethrowers and grenades on live targets tied to stakes. This wasn't research, it was an industrialization of murder. The unit also went into the field, dropping plague-infected fleas over Chinese cities, causing outbreaks that killed tens of thousands.
The experiments were beyond comprehension. Vivisections without anesthesia to study the effects of disease on living tissue.
They tested frostbite by freezing limbs and then thawing them in boiling water. All in the name of high-altitude survival research.
As the Red Army advanced in 1945, the order was given: destroy everything, burn the evidence.
Strategic failure. They believed biological weapons would win the war. Instead, they infected their own troops during field tests in China. Between 3,000 and 250,000 people died here. The strategic betrayal. The US granted Ishii and his staff immunity. We wanted the data more than we wanted justice. When the Soviets advanced in 1945, the order was erase everything. The buildings were blown up. The evidence was buried. But the most shocking move wasn't the crime. It was the cover-up. The US gave Ishii and his team immunity in exchange for their data.
Decoding the cost. 10,000 lab deaths, 300,000 field casualties. One deal with the devil that haunts international law.
The EE transaction. American intelligence traded justice for the biological ledger. Human lives for a data point in the Cold War.
Unit 731 proves that when strategy loses its moral compass, the scientists become the most dangerous soldiers on the battlefield.
Japan believed biological terror would secure their empire. Instead, it became a strategic stain they can never erase.
Nanking was a breakdown of command. Unit 731 was the command itself going insane. But wait until you see the next strategic failure.
The final count. 12 nation citizens were victims. 0 Japanese scientists were tried by the US. A total strategic evasion of accountability.
Coming up, the Bataan Death March. When surrender becomes more dangerous than the battlefield itself.
What happens when a military can't handle the logistic of its own victory? The numbers of the dead will tell you the answer. Stay alert.
But as one nightmare ended in the north, another began in the south. A march of death across the Philippine Islands. Next, the Bataan Death March, where logistics failed so completely that survival became a war crime.
If science was the weapon in Manchuria, logistics was the killer in the Philippines. Did you catch the secret code in the Dr. Tan's mask? Watch closely.
The failure of logistics soon turned into a failure of honor, marked by unimaginable cruelty.
As a strategist, I analyze victory not by the ground gained, but by how a command handles the aftermath. Bataan was a failure of both.
April 1942, the Philippines. 76,000 starving American and Filipino soldiers lay down their arms.
When the logs stop burning, the truth begins to chill. See you in the Bataan jungle. The march is starting.
General Homa expected 25,000 captives. He got 3 times that number. In the world of strategy, an uncounted variable is a disaster.
No food was issued. No water provided. The strategic intent was to move them fast.
The Bataan Death March. For 6 harrowing days, the prisoners were marched 65 miles through the scorching jungles of the Philippines.
The solution was the march. 65 miles to Camp O'Donnell. But this wasn't a transfer. It was a brutal filtration of the weak.
The Japanese military code, Bushido, saw surrender as the ultimate shame.
Part 3. Bataan. The logistics of starvation would prove as deadly as any bullet or bomb. In the art of war, a surrender isn't the end of a mission. It's the beginning of a logistical responsibility.
It wasn't just cruelty, it was a breakdown of military administration. A command that cannot feed its prisoners is a command losing control.
The casualty log. 18,000 Filipinos and 650 Americans murdered on the road. As a strategist, I see the Bushido breakdown. To the captors, surrender was the ultimate shame. Tubing were no longer soldiers, they were baggage.
If you stop to drink from a mud puddle.
At Camp O'Donnell, the tragedy only deepened. Dysentery and malaria killed 26,000 more with it. Japan believed this brutality would terrify the US. The sun treatment. Prisoners were forced to sit in the blistering heat for hours without shade. A psychological strike to break the Western spirit.
But this wasn't just malice. It was a failure of command. An army that cannot feed its captives is an army that has lost control of its own victory.
From a tactical perspective, they wasted a massive labor force. Dead prisoners cannot build fortifications. A strategic waste of human capital.
The march lasted only days, but the strategic blowback lasted years. It unified American public opinion for unconditional surrender. Strategically, Japan gained the island, but created a martyr. Remember Bataan became the fuel for the American war machine.
General Homa claimed he didn't know. In military law, ignorance of your subordinate's crimes is not a defense. It's an admission of failure.
Strategic blunder. They wasted a massive labor force.
Strategists study Bataan to learn what happens when ideology overrides logistics. When hate becomes the only operational plan. The march was the end for many, but for the war, it was just the fuel. The vengeance that followed would burn Japan to its roots. General Homa was later executed for these crimes. He claimed he didn't know. But in strategy, not knowing is the ultimate failure. Bataan proved that when ideology overrides logistics, victory is just another form of defeat, a debt that would be paid back in Tokyo. By 1946, the debt was paid in Manila and Tokyo.
The march lasted days, but the strategic blowback lasted years.
18,000 voices were silenced in the jungle, but their echo reached the White House.
We have felt the heat of the Philippines. Now, we move to the cold, silent forest.
Did you count the soldiers in the march? One of them isn't who he seems. Look again before we enter the Katyn Woods.
Did you notice the soldier in the march who was carrying a secret map? His survival changed the invasion of 1945. Look again.
In strategy, the loudest screams are often the ones buried deepest. Join me in the next briefing. The numbers are waiting.
Part 4. The Katyn Massacre Sound, the Decapitation Tactic, and Geopolitical Era.
As a strategist, I know that to destroy a nation, you don't kill its soldiers, you kill its leaders. Katyn was the ultimate decapitation strike.
Good! Behind us!
In this briefing, we analyze the strategic decapitation, how the Soviet Union...
Part 4.
"22,000 victims. Not just officers, but doctors, lawyers, and priests.
Strategically, Moscow wanted to ensure that if Poland ever rose again, it would be a body without a head, a puppet state with no voice. The method was chillingly efficient. Prisoners were led into a soundproof room or to the edge of a pit, one bullet to the back of the neck.
Why German bullets? A strategic trick. If the bodies were ever found, the blame would fall squarely on the Nazis. A lie planned from day one.
The method was chillingly efficient. Prisoners were led down proof room.
For decades, the Soviet Union maintained this strategic lie. It was a foundation of their control over Eastern Europe for half a century.
Via strategic error, Stalin believed dead men tell no tales. He failed to account for the forensic power of the truth decades later.
Citizens must disregard the rumors. Only the official press represents the truth. Churchill and Roosevelt knew, but strategically they needed Stalin to crush Hitler. Justice was sacrificed for the greater good. This wasn't just a war crime. It was ethnic cleansing of the mind. A nation's memory was buried in Russian soil.
The Soviet denial lasted until 1990. The secret files were finally opened. It proves that a massacre, no matter how deeply buried, create a political ghost that can haunt an empire to its death. Geopolitical impact. Katyn remains a permanent scar, a wound that prevents true strategic...
Strategists study Katyn to understand plausible deniability. It failed because the scale of the atrocity was too massive to hide forever.
The bullet in the neck was a short-term tactical solution to a long-term political problem. A classic failure of strategic foresight.
The fatal mistake. The Soviets thought they were killing Poland. Instead, they made Katyn the soul of Polish resistance for generations.
22,000 lives. One night. Worst.
seen the silent execution in the north. Now, we return to the chaos of the south, where a city...
The Manila Massacre, when a defeated army decides that if they can't have a city, no one can. 100,000 dead.
Strategically, it was useless. Morally, it was the end. But the numbers will show you the true scale of the madness.
Did you spot the NKVD officer in the Katyn footage?
Move up! Clear right! Copy that! Contact front!
In strategic terms, Manila 1945 was a masterpiece of pointless destruction. February 1945, the Japanese strategic position was terminal. General Yamashita ordered a withdrawal, but the Navy refused to leave. What followed was a 29-day nightmare. The breakdown of military discipline turned a defense operation into a systematic slaughter. "12,500 sailors and Marines, cornered and desperate, decided that if the Pearl of the Orient wasn't theirs, it would belong to no one. They burned the Intramuros, the historic walled city, using flamethrowers on hospitals and grenades in churches packed with refugees.
Strategically, the Japanese used the civilian population as human shields, then as targets. 100,000 Filipinos were murdered in cold blood.
This wasn't scorched earth to deny resources. It was a scorched soul policy, a total rejection of the rules of engagement.
The Yamashita Standard was born here. A commander is legally responsible for the crimes of his troops, even if he didn't order them.
Strategic error. Japan believed this horror would slow the U.S. advance. Instead, it accelerated their own total annihilation.
The Navy's refusal to obey the Army created a strategic vacuum. In war, a divided command is a death warrant for everyone involved.
Manila, once the most beautiful city in Asia, became a funeral pyre. Its scars are etched into the stone and the DNA of a nation.
Why didn't they surrender? Because the ideology of Gyokusai, shattered jewel, demanded a beautiful death over a shameful survival.
The casualty log. 100,000 civilian deaths.
Strategists study Manila to see what happens when total war meets a defeatist mindset. It is the recipe for a holocaust. Decoding the strategy. The massacre was a tactical delay that cost Japan its last shred of international sympathy in the Pacific.
The battle for Manila proved that a cornered beast is at its most dangerous, when it has nothing left to lose but its honor.
VE fatal error. The Japanese leadership mistook cruelty for strength. They forgot that war is about the peace that follows.
100,000 voices were lost to decisions made at the top. A strategic debt that history can never fully repay.
Was it a military necessity or a desperate attempt to halt the inevitable tide of D-Day? The numbers will shock you.
We have seen fire in the east. Now the focus shifts to the heart of Europe.
Coming up, Oradour-sur-Glane, a village erased in a single afternoon.
Look again. In war, there are no small mistakes, only small graves. Join me for the next briefing. The forest is waiting.